Thank you. Good afternoon. Chairman Sanders and the Government and Military Affairs Committee. My name is Loren Lippincott. That's Loren Lippincott. And I do represent the District 34 here in Nebraska. In 2022, the Nebraska legislature passed legislative resolution number 1414, which was an application to Congress for a convention of states. This year, my legislative resolution was bestowed the same number, LR 14. LR 14 would rescind our current application, which does have a sunset clause, which is the 1st of February, 2027, and replace it with the same application simply without the sunset. This legislative resolution calls for the state of Nebraska to call for a limited Article 5 conventions of states, which would discuss and potentially propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. A convention of states cannot be called without 33 states, that's 2/3, 34 states passing matching resolutions to call for one. Currently, there are 19 states which have the same language as ours on the books. And of course, Nebraska is one of those 19. There is legislation in all 31 of the other states introduced and up for discussion. Now, once 34 states, that is 2/3 of the states, have passed the same language, an Article 5 Convention of States is called. Every state would be represented, and through a convention process, amendments are proposed. The proposed amendments can be ratified if 38 states, that is 3/4 of the 50 states, vote favorably. Legislative resolution number 14 calls for a convention to propose 3 specific topics for amendments. Number 1, they would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Of course, as we all know, the national debt right now is at $36 trillion, and the clock just continues to tick. And it's very interesting to note that not only do we have a $36 trillion debt, but it's well over $100 trillion invested spending for entitlement programs like Social Security. Interest on the debt just this past year has now exceeded our defense spending. Number 2, limit the power and jurisdiction of federal government. It's interesting to note that regulation compliance cost $3 trillion a year. That was in 2022, which was 12% of our GDP. That's more than all personal income tax and corporate tax combined. This causes an economic loss of 25% or $4 trillion a year. That's considerable. Point number 3, limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. It's interesting to note that over 90% of incumbents in the U.S. House and Senate are reelected each election cycle. The status quo is not working. By requiring matching resolutions by 34 states, that is 2/3 of the states, it naturally creates a structured framework for the subjects discussed during the convention. This is so important because this is the limiting factor and why the runaway convention argument does not work. These 3 topics are what they are gathered to talk about and to create amendments for. This process is laid out in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution as a method to propose amendments to the Constitution. This is not an instrument to rewrite the Constitution or create some kind of new government. Article 5 even explicitly states that a convention can only meet for the purpose of proposing amendments. Article 5 provides equality between Congress and states when it comes to proposing amendments to the Constitution. The opposing side will argue that we're not in control and that the convention can run away. They will argue that there is no control in the process and that once a convention convenes, the delegates will become, quote, drunk with power, that they have been given and to go off track and outside the subject matter within the resolution that it called. But If 34 states must have identical language in the resolutions that they pass in each state, then those states, which will be the majority at the convention, will know the lines within they need to color. They are bound to the scope that is in the resolution. However, if that is the only reason or concern, that is why I've introduced LB 259. We'll be discussing that in a bit. That outlines and ensures that Nebraska delegates to such a convention would be bound to the scope and subject matter in the state's application. Even if the convention were to, quote, run away, and they were to bring amendments to vote for the Easter Bunny as president, any proposed amendment that would be agreed upon would go back to the states for ratification. That's important. And it would take 3/4 of the states, that is 38 states, voting in favor of the amendment to make that happen. And of course, 3/4 is the same as Congress when they propose amendments to the Constitution. Same for them, same for us. So let's pretend now that 34 states have passed the same resolution. Now, again, just as a review, 19 presently have passed it. We need 15 more. That would equal 34. So let's just go forward in time and talk through this. We would all then send delegates, and they would agree on amendments. Now, the only thing that Congress has to do in this is they have to determine where and when that meeting would take place. So let's just say, for instance, they said, Omaha is right in the middle of the United States. We'll have it in Omaha on such and such date. So everybody meets right there, and then 38 out of the 50 states would have to agree upon it. So that would be 3/4. Those amendments come back to Nebraska for ratification. The same process for adopting an amendment made by Congress would then revert to our rules. Then it would be our legislature that would have to work on this. Our rules say that under Rule 4, Section 2 of the Rules of the Nebraska Unicameral Legislature, quote, states, and I quote, when considered as a bill, resolutions which propose amendments to the state constitution propose the ratification or rejection of amendments to the federal constitution or memorialize the Congress with regard to amendments to the U.S. Constitution shall be considered and adopted in the same manner as bills. So it'd be much like how we do things here today with our normal legislative bills. The Government and Military Affairs Committee would then be referenced or would refer and reference any such amendment. So the same process of public notice, testimony, committee member questions would happen as we have here today. Then it would have to go through the executive committee. They would have to exec on it. And that process would then vote the bill out of committee. If passed, it would go to the floor for debate. If fully debated and passed by the legislature, then the state of Nebraska would have ratified it, and 49 other states would process any amendment in their own manner. Then if, and only if, 38 of the 50 states ratify the proposed amendment, does it get added to the Constitution? This is not something that will be done easily. In fact, only 27 amendments have been ratified by the requisite number of states, and 10 of those, of course, as we know, is the Bill of Rights, making it only 17. There are 6 proposed amendments now that have yet to be ratified by 38 states. That's a high bar with guardrails in place so that there's no fear of runaway convention. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to note that from 1789 to current day, there's been 11,848 proposed amendments to the Constitution. And of course, we only have 27. So there's a lot of filters.